Hello, everyone. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the first page of Rudyard Kipling's The Mark of the Beast. We've already discussed the setting of this piece and how it contributes to the weird atmosphere. Now we're going to take a look at the characters and the ways in which Kipling is attempting to use them as a means of commenting on the colonial issues inside this text. Every one of these characters, Strickland, a member of the military police, the soldiers that we meet at the New Year's Eve party, Fleete, who is an inheritor who has received colonial holdings from his family and has now gone to India to manage them, and the narrator himself, are all colonial officials. They're not all soldiers per se, but they're all part of this large, massive edifice of colonialism, whether it be the mercantile side, the military side, or the like. Kipling is using these characters as part of both his attempts to reflect on the colonial enterprise in India, and also as a way to appropriately establish the kinds of weird sentiments or the feeling of the weird that's going to carry through the rest of the story. Much is going on in this first page underneath the surface. If we parse out these characters' actions and try to better understand them in conjunction with the language that Kipling tries to employ while describing them, we'll better understand the kind of relationship that exists between them. So in order to do that, we have three guiding questions here. First, other than offering Fleete a chance to get drunk, why might Kipling have included this scene? What are the partygoers doing here, considering its function on a colonial context? Second, how is Fleete characterized at the outset of the tale? How are we meant to react to him, and how does the narrator seem to view him? What kind of relationship does the narrator have with the main character, or with the main character Fleete? And 2.5, which means it's kind of like an outgrowth or a supporting question for question 2. You can think about it as you're thinking about question 2. The partygoers swear that they're all dear friends. Does anything suggest this statement is untrue? If so, why are they not so positively inclined towards some of the other guests? Pause the video, take a few minutes to think about these questions and to grapple with them so you get some experience engaging with the text. Try to look for specific detail and see if you can find answers to these questions, and then return to this video where I'll discuss some of my ideas. So, in the colonial context, question 1. One of the purposes of this scene is to establish a kind of homosocial bond between the men at the edge of the empire. Look at the way in which this party is being described. In the final large paragraph at the end of the first page of the story, on New Year's Eve, there was a big dinner at the club, and the night was excusably wet. When men foregather from the outermost ends of the empire, they have a right to be riotous. Already, we're getting this commentary on the nature of service by these soldiers. The soldiers have a right to be riotous, and the night was excusably wet. In other words, there was a great deal of drinking, and we can see the effects of it later on in this paragraph when we see that they tried to play pool with a rolled-up hedgehog. Right? They're so drunk, they're stumbling around. They pick up a hedgehog that has curled itself into a ball and then try to use it to play pool. So these are the actions of people who are ridiculously drunk. And yet, the narrator suggests that these men have a right to such behavior because they have served the empire. There was a general closing up of ranks and taking stock of our losses in dead or disabled that had fallen during the past year. It was a very wet night, and I remember that we sang Old Lang Syne with our feet in the Polo Championship Cup and our heads among the stars, and we swore that we were all dear friends. And then after this moment, then some of us went away and annexed Burma. So some of us went out to take more territory for the empire. Some of us tried to open up the Sudan and were opened up by fuzzies in that cruel scrub outside Suakim. So some of us were opened up, we were cut open, we were killed. And some found stars and medals, and some were married, which was bad, and some did other things, which was worse. And others of us stayed in our chains and strove to make money on insufficient experiences. There's a kind of bitterness behind the narrator's reflections, conveyed to us through the juxtaposition and bathos of these comparisons, right? Some of us were married, which was bad, and some of us did other things that were worse. So at the very moment, he's moving from us being gutted outside these cruel scrubs near Suakim, some of us getting married, some of us getting stars and medals. So it's reducing everything here and all the stars and medals and the small accolades and finances that the soldiers earn for their lives and their deaths. It's reducing it all to trivial farce because that's all that they're perceived as. It's all that they get for their service. Nothing. Yes, they get their medals, or they get death, or they get a wife, or they just eke out a subsistence existence. On the one hand, the narrator is presenting to us this perspective on the soldiers that they have this right to be riotous because they're serving the empire and getting nothing for it. And on the other hand, there's this critique of how the soldiers are being treated or mistreated by the colonizers. The nation is getting rich off this colony, and yet the people who are actually securing it for them and giving their lives, sacrificing their lives to do it, get almost nothing. And yet there is this bond of loyalty and camaraderie between them. The character that disrupts this bond is Fleete. Fleete is a nearly functionless colonial official. Look at the way in which he's described relative to the soldiers. Well, the soldiers are willing and able to sacrifice their lives. This man has to be taken away by his friends in a guard of dishonor. So when Fleete is stumbling drunk, they look at him and they start to take him home, and the narrator describes it as Strickland and himself forming a guard of dishonor. Well, he was completely fine with the other soldiers getting drunk. He actually thinks of Fleete getting drunk as something disreputable, something disgraceful. So this purposeful service and the willingness to make sacrifices on the parts of the soldiers set them in a different class or category than Fleete. They have a right to things and to actions that Fleete himself does not. Now, Fleete came to India, we see in paragraph 4. When Fleete came to India, he owned a little money and some land in the Himalayas near a place called Dharmasala. Both properties had been left to him by an uncle, and he came out to finance them. He was a big, heavy, genial, and inoffensive man. His knowledge of the natives was, of course, limited, and he complained of the difficulties of language. So here we have a man who is functionless, he's purposeless. Unlike the soldiers who have paid for everything they've got, the pittance that they've got, with their blood and their sweat and their lives in many cases, Fleete has just inherited his holdings here, and he's living large off the acquisitions of other people that have just been left to him. He doesn't actually have a purpose here. He doesn't serve any purpose. He doesn't do anything. He's just living large off his inheritance. And what compounds this failure of his character and his status as someone who is antithetical and set against the soldiers is that he complains of the difficulties of language. This is a man who is ignorant of the language of the natives, completely ignorant of their traditions and the like, and yet he actually complains. There's no effort on his part to actually ameliorate his condition, to learn or to strive to learn. He looks at the language, he looks at the natives, he dismisses them as savages, looks at the language and says, that's too difficult for me to learn, so I'm not going to bother. He remains ignorant, which is one of his great flaws, but the worst one is that he remains willfully ignorant. Fleete is thus excluded from this party. The other characters don't like him. Even Strickland the narrator seem to barely tolerate him because of his ignorance and his drunkenness. And yet it's the same drunkenness we see in the soldiers. The reason being that Fleete, well, he's worthless. He knows nothing of the sacrifices that have been made by all these other people who actually serve a purpose in the colonialist system. Now, Fleete, in turn, is abjectly disrespectful towards the indigenous peoples of this nation. Not only does he fail to learn the language, when he sees their god, which the narrator says is a deity worthy of respect, he mocks it and derides it and reduces it to the status of an animal. So again, let's continue this comparison and contrast between Strickland and the narrator and Fleete. And we'll see how Kipling is framing two different perspectives of colonialism through the characters. The narrator on page 2 of the story, paragraph 2, says, a road lay through the bazaar, close to a little temple of Hanuman, the monkey god, who is a leading divinity worthy of respect. All gods have good points, just as have all priests. Personally, I attach much importance to Hanuman, and am kind to his people, the great gray apes of the hills. One never knows when one may want a friend. So the narrator has compassion and empathy and seeks to understand as best as possible the traditions of the colonized subjects. He doesn't dismiss them like Fleete. Instead, he wants to understand them as best as possible and accords them or affords them the respect that they're due. Strickland, too, is tasked with understanding the natives. So everything about his position as a colonial officer of the police is oriented around understanding the natives and besting them at their own game. He tries to overcome them. He tries to control them in his role. But the way that he does that is by learning as much about them and their traditions as he can. And it shows through in the respectful and deferential attitude that he has towards the priest of Hanuman. Now, in contrast, Fleete, well, he acts in accordance with the character that has already been established. In the next paragraph, there was a light on in the temple, and we passed. And as we passed, we could hear voices of men chanting hymns. In a native temple, the priests rise at all hours of the night to do honor to their god. Before we could stop him, Fleete dashed up the steps, patted two priests on the back, and was gravely grinding the ashes of his cigar butt into the forehead of the red stone image of Hanuman. Strickland tried to drag him out, but he sat down and said solemnly, "See that? Mark of the beast, I made it. Isn't it fine?" So, Fleete runs up to the statue and performs this act of blasphemy. He doesn't know anything about the statue of Hanuman. He doesn't understand the native language. He doesn't understand their traditions or their religions, unlike the narrator. He just disrespects it, mars it. Then he says that good old Hanuman made a very soft pillow, so he curls up on the ground and uses part of the statue as a pillow. It is at this point that the silver man, a leper whose skin has begun to turn white and flake off because it's dead and leprous, comes out and then essentially assaults Fleete and transfers a kind of curse to him, as we learn later on in the story. But from this initial depiction of these three characters, we already get a sense of two different visions of colonialism that are embodied by them. On the one hand, you have Strickland and the narrator, who are concerned with understanding and respecting the natives as much as possible while still maintaining that colonial enterprise. We also have the soldiers aligned with them, who are due, in Kipling's view, respect and certain allowances because of all the sacrifices they make. And then we have Fleete. Fleete, a man who is utterly disrespectful, a man who serves no purpose, and who only exists to grow large, to grow fat and wealthy off his colonial holdings, and has no desire to respect or to understand the people that he's controlling. In turn, look at what happens to these three characters. As you continue in this story and we move on to the next in a series of videos, think about what Kipling is saying through his depiction of these characters and what happens to them as a result of the perspectives that they have about colonialism and the colonized subjects here in India.